So I'll start by thanking the organising team for inviting me to deliver the presentation of my work. It's a real honour. I've really enjoyed the conference. As has been said, I'm academic dean at the University of Exeter with responsibility for all taught programmes in every discipline. And the last 2 to 3 years have been an absolute nightmare to be doing that role. It's the worst time, I think, possibly in history, to have responsibility for taught programmes. So it's so nice to have a week where I'm talking with friends and colleagues about the subject I love. And I think the presentations have been excellent. And I've really enjoyed the discussions. So it's great. And it's obviously sunny all the time in Riga, so that helps as well. So I'm going to talk about my research, but I shall start, as other people have done, by reflecting on the title of the conference. My primary interest, my background, working with Stephen Parker and Jonathan Doney and others, has been in the history of religious education in England. So used to, dusty archives and primary documentary sources and so on. And it's through that historical analysis, I suppose, that I'm aware that on many occasions and circumstances in the past, religious education could be described as being at a crossroads, being at an intersection of two or more possible directions of travel, crucial moments at which a decision needed to be made about which road to follow. Indeed, feeling that you're living at a time of unprecedented change might actually represent a point of continuity between the past and the present. Maybe people always feel they're living at a moment of change. I'm also aware that many of the so-called new directions for religious education, which have been identified over the years in England, haven't been new at all. They're simply the same set of possible routes forward as have been identified previously, albeit they're represented at a new point in time and possibly mapped out in a slightly different way. And it may well be I'm as guilty of that today as other people have been in the past. Thus, in recognition of the repetitiveness with which some of the same possible futures have been considered time after time, we might think about complementing the metaphor of RE at a crossroads with that of RE on a roundabout. And here I'm reminded of Caroline's presentation where she quoted Stephen Parker, RE being on a treadmill, RE on a roundabout. On occasions in the history of English RE, and with regard to some matters particularly, we've gone round and round and round and round, surveying roughly the same set of available exit routes, but without the wherewithal to decide which to select and or the political, legal and other means to act on that decision. So, for example, there have been perpetual debates over the last half century about whether the parameters of core subject knowledge in English RE extend to Christianity, the so-called Big Six world religions, other religions and non-religious worldviews, and more besides. Long-standing indecision extends beyond questions of curriculum content to uncertainty about the rationale for and the aims and purposes of RE. Historically, the subject has been afforded numerous aims, including, but not limited to, there's many more than this, some of which we've heard at the conference, nurturing pupils' faith and spirituality, transmitting cultural heritage, such as Christian values and practices, developing the whole person spiritually or morally, or improving society, perhaps by fostering community cohesion and citizenship. The effect of these unresolved debates and ongoing uncertainties is that it's sometimes been challenging to identify the distinctiveness and specific purpose of RE as a discrete curriculum subject. This has particularly been the case in schools in which classroom religious education has been intimately connected to the more general ethos and values of the whole school, perhaps most notably in publicly funded schools with a religious affiliation. In this regard, the conferral upon RE of more holistic and overarching educational aims and purposes means that religious education has often been broadly defined and conceived as standing outside and sometimes opposed to the long-standing, subject-based, intellectually orientated and qualification-driven core curriculum of English state-maintained schools. Some people think that's good. I think that positioning has been problematic and the root cause of many of the challenges we currently face. We could probably have a good debate about that. So my paper today is on my specialist subject. It's all about me. It's a lived experience piece. And I'm going to report the journey I've taken and the route for the subject that I have planned and promoted. That is, since I turned my hand from being solely focused on researching the history of RE to contributing to contemporary discourses about RE policy and classroom practice today. Now, you'll have to judge whether I'm an example of fools rushing in where angels fear to tread, because that is not my historical background. That's not my personal historical background. My background is more in the kind of history of the subject. But I've delved into this, the public and political and parental and professional debates. Now, I like to think that I've learned lessons from the past and that those have helped me to avoid dead ends, cul-de-sacs, U-turns, or any other route forward that might turn out to be circular or cyclical. However, that would be arrogant, and it's inevitable that I have gone over ground previously trodden by others, and that you may know of researchers and or teachers who've gone further than me down the same path, or indeed who have found better ways to navigate the same landscape differently. And for that reason, I look forward to hearing the response and the discussion at the end of my paper. But I shall begin by recounting my journey with reference to a specific report. Almost a decade ago, and this is the one that really sparked my interest in the contemporary debates, and it came from the English Schools Inspectorate, known as Ofsted. Their 2013 report entitled Religious Education, Realising the Potential. And it argued that RE in English schools is generally overcrowded, incoherent, and confusing for pupils, and the curriculum is commonly lacking in terms of progression, coherence, and breadth and balance. And it was in response to repeated claims such as this that I began to get involved in initiatives that sought to reconsider what potential RE has in the present day and how that might be best realised in policy and practice. So what I present is a mixture of theory and practice, all developed for the specific context of multi-faith RE in non-religiously affiliated schools in England. And it's work that I've undertaken both with teachers, so there's a strong practical element to it, but also that I've undertaken with colleagues in education and in the Department of Theology and Religion at Exeter. So I'll start with this project. On the left-hand side is the front cover of a report called Big Ideas for Religious Education. On the right-hand side is a reference to a journal article that I wrote in response to that report, where even though I was a participant and contributor to the former, I also was a critic of what we produced. So I wasn't particularly popular for doing so, but I did write a report to say, here's some things that we didn't quite get right, and I want to put that right. But this initiative was a symposium. It came out of a symposium organised by myself and a former schools inspector, Dr. Barbara Winterskill, who I think participated in this conference last time. And we spoke about this report together to identify principles and big ideas for RE. And the purpose was to guide teachers' curriculum decision-making with regard to selecting and sequencing subject content knowledge. So it was a question really about coherence and progression. So we developed 6 big ideas that sought to provide a holistic appreciation of interconnected and overarching core ideas within the subject. There's some similarity between these and the threshold concepts that were spoken about the other day. Big ideas attempt to make meaning from the minutiae, identify relationships, and posit predominant patterns. I think they incorporate and advocate theories and generalizations about religions and worldviews, and thereby they act as lenses through which the more detailed subject matter can be viewed. Consequently, they seek to ensure the central concerns of the subject are memorable, have long-term relevance, and are transferable to events outside of the classroom. Those are all of the aspirations. So here's a slide. You may not be able to read the smaller text, but I will summarize it for you. There were 6 big ideas. Continuity, change, and diversity, making sense of life's experiences, words and beyond, influence, community, culture, and power, a good life, the big picture. Those were the titles that we gave. Those are the broad elements of the curriculum that we thought teachers should cover. These aren't what you would teach to students, to pupils, but these are the sort of the descriptors that would help teachers select material to teach under those broad headings. So the general descriptions of religions and non-religious worldviews encompassed by these big ideas, again, included but weren't limited to, top left, patterns of diversity and change over time. Top right, transformative experiences, rituals, and practices. Then different forms of communication and expression. Interaction with and influence over wider communities and cultures. Bottom left, conceptions of morality and the good life, both personally and collectively. And then the last one, the most contentious, put at the end to try to minimize the debate and contestation, because we knew that everyone would go mad about that one, is about the sort of the grand narratives of how and why the world is as it is. However, in generating big ideas to support curriculum development and design, several questions were raised by myself and a colleague who I employed to work with me on this follow-up project, and I put them on the slide. Is it possible to develop big ideas that apply universally across all religions and worldviews? The fact that I'm asking that question hints at the fact that I think the answer is no, or probably not. How can any list of big ideas avoid charges of reductionism or oversimplification, or of presenting religions and worldviews as bounded, homogeneous, and fixed? How can a singular and finite list of big ideas accommodate the diversity of different theories and understandings people have about religions and worldviews? And would different groups of people living and working in different contexts with diverse backgrounds endorse the same or different sets of big ideas? These were the questions I was wrestling with from a sort of theoretical point of view. Barbara and the team, mostly made up of teachers and so on, was interested in something that was simple enough to be able to be applied in practice with teachers and with schools. But I thought there was some complexity that we needed to hint at, and possibly the big ideas needed to be shifted into hypotheses to be tested. So to avert the theoretical challenges which underpinned and which are implicit within these questions, we looked for inspiration again at Win Harlan's project called Principles and Big Ideas of Science Education. That's where we'd started. His project had provided us with our initial inspiration, but there was an element of his project that we missed, and that element related to the need to pay significant attention to issues of epistemology and methodology in science, e.g. scientific activity, ideas about science, scientific capabilities, scientific attitudes, scientific inquiry. In total, Harlan's project created 14 big ideas in science, and they were then divided into 10 big ideas of science, ideas about the world around, scale, symmetry, causality, form, function, as well as 4 big ideas about science, ideas about the way in which scientific ideas are generated and applied. And I thought, to resolve some of the questions that I had raised with Helen, that we could mirror that schema in religious education, and we could orientate RE not around, or not just around, the original set of big ideas that we had generated through the symposium, but also around a second set. So we had big ideas of the study of religions and worldviews. That's ideas about religions and worldviews themselves. But then big ideas about the study of religions and worldviews, i.e. epistemological and methodological ideas concerning where, when, how, by whom, and why are ideas about religions and worldviews generated and discussed. Where do we get all our knowledge from on this curriculum? Where do those big ideas emerge from? In developing big ideas about the study of religions and worldviews, we focus on 4 questions. 1, what is the focus of study? 2, by whom is it being studied? 3, how is it being studied? And 4, why is it being studied? And those 4 questions underpin the 4 big ideas about the study of religions and worldviews that we generated. We considered each question in terms of different types of encounter. Encountering religions and worldviews. The emphasis here being on recognizing the contested nature of definitions and descriptions in this realm and the importance of context. So here I'm noting that within the religious education discourse and beyond, those long-standing debates about, theory of religion or theory of worldviews or whatever it might be, let's put that on the curriculum. That is a big idea. There's no agreement about this. Encountering oneself, acknowledging the positionality of the learner and the need for reflexivity and reflectivity. So an acceptance of some subjectivity or partiality on the basis of researchers, teachers, learners. Encountering methodologies and methods, accepting the need for learners to discern between a diversity of available ways of knowing. There's no one singular way of studying religion or worldviews. There's a multiplicity. And then lastly, one that sort of transcends them all really, encountering the real world, highlighting the relevance and transferability of what is learned in RE, all designed to map onto what Wyn Harlan had done on his project about science. So I'll briefly talk about each big idea in turn to give you a flavour of my thinking and what overarching messages should be conveyed by teaching and learning in RE. And what I say will maps onto what's on the slide there, which you may or may not be able to read. So starting with the first one, encountering religions and worldviews. Definitions of religions and worldviews are multitudinous and contested. There's no universal agreement about the nature of religions and worldviews, either individually or collectively. In recognition of this, we believe choices about the representation of religions and worldviews within the curriculum should be explicitly acknowledged and scrutinized in RE. A critical, analytical, empathetic, inquisitive approach with awareness of the dynamic context in which religions and worldview exist is required at all times. Religions and worldviews are complex, diverse, multifaceted. They evolve, they're multidimensional phenomena. They include laws, literature, languages, people, places, practices. Religions and worldviews can be studied through one or more of their constituent dimensions, such as doctrines, narratives, ethics, rituals, experiential or emotional happenings, institutional structures, material artifacts. But these dimensions are also disputed. There's other ways of conceptualizing and or representing religions and worldviews. Indeed, we might reject those terms altogether and consider alternatives. That should be discussed within religious education. For this reason, we believe it's important to raise awareness of the rationale for and ramifications of chosen forms of representation in RE. Next one, encountering oneself. Who we are, our backgrounds and identities, our cultures and exposure to differing cultures and the time period in which we live affects and sometimes determines what we know about religions and worldviews. Encounters with unfamiliar peoples, cultures, religions and worldviews assist us in understanding ourselves better, equipping us to investigate and understand religions and worldviews. Learners' worldviews influence and are influenced by their study of religions and worldviews. No learner is neutral or objective. Through encountering oneself in the learning process, learners can reflect on their dispositions and worldviews and how these affect and are affected by their learning about and representation of religions and worldviews. Learners can be taught to engage with their personal identities, ask existential questions, and explore varying religious and worldview dimensions, thereby developing a broader and deeper understanding of their personal positioning and that of others. So I'll just move away from this slide for the moment and talk about a different project that relates to that particular big idea. In the book Metacognition, Worldviews and Religious Education, which I co-authored with Shirley Larkin, Jonathan Doney, and my brother Giles Freathy, which possibly has the worst front cover of any book I have ever seen. We reported the outcomes of a research project called Reflect, a program to foster metacognition in the religious education classroom. The project was undertaken by researchers at the university in collaboration with 6 teacher volunteers, and it sought to support the teachers to turn their primary school religious education classrooms into metacognitively-orientated learning environments, partly by creating 3 physical zones. The first was a meta-thinking zone, promoting thinking about thinking and learning in RE. The second was a worldview zone, promoting thinking about oneself as a learner in RE. And lastly, a resources zone, promoting thinking about representations of religious and non-religious phenomena in RE. The aim, in accordance with Shirley Larkin's definitions of metacognition, was to create a safe psychosocial space in which pupils were supported and empowered to learn together, to develop their own individual self-awareness and self-concept as learners, and in which every teacher-pupil and pupil-pupil interaction promoted learning dispositions, enhanced cognitive and metacognitive abilities, and challenged emotive blocks to learning. To promote pupils' knowledge or metacognitive knowledge, meta-knowing, about their own developing worldviews in the worldview zone, pupils were provided with opportunities to engage in personal evaluation, self-reflection, reflexivity. And this was undertaken in a systematic, in-depth, continuous, and methodical manner by requiring pupils to capture in worldview profiles a kind of reflective diary that they had to keep all the way through their studies, their responses to questions contained within a relatively comprehensive worldview questions framework that we developed, but which was inspired by the work of John Vaughan, a Canadian scholar who you might be aware of. It represented a practical method by which pupils were encouraged to recognize, reflect on, understand, and articulate their own worldviews. They then had to compare and contrast their personal worldviews with those of others whom they were studying, and then to explain how their worldviews influenced or are influenced by their learning about religions and worldviews. So this hopefully enabled pupils to monitor and regulate their subjectivity as learners, to teach them how positioning, partiality can influence the nature and purpose of learning, meaning making, and knowledge producing processes. Now, we included quite a lengthy evaluation of the strengths and weaknesses of the approach in the book. In fact, the book provides a very frank and honest assessment of how well we thought the project had gone or not gone. And I would not necessarily endorse now the worldview profiling approach as we implemented it, but it was viewed extremely positively and enjoyed by the participant teachers and pupils alike. They really liked completing the worldview profiles and seemed to find lots more benefit in doing that than we found. And it does at least constitute one practical example of how one might teach about reflexivity, reflectivity, and positionality in the study of religions and worldviews. So I'll return back to these big ideas. Encountering methodologies and methods. The study of religions and worldviews is inherently multidisciplinary and methodologically diverse. The disciplinary and methodological approaches taken to the study of religious and worldview-related phenomena will contribute significantly to the results and conclusions of such study. Multiple interpretations, methodologies, and methods can be used to generate knowledge about religions and worldviews, and there's a plurality of potential disciplinary perspectives, interdisciplinary philosophical or theoretical frameworks, and data sources: theological, philosophical, anthropological, feminist, post-colonial, textual, artistic, architectural, etc., etc. On the basis of these assumptions, I have devised and exemplified relevant pedagogical procedures to encourage teachers and pupils to attend to the diversity and effect of epistemological and methodological approaches in the study of religions and worldviews. In this regard, and in collaboration with others, most notably my brother Giles, who was working as a primary school practitioner at the time, I've developed the researcher's approach intended for primary schools, and then subsequently the Who is Jesus textbook that was written for secondary schools. Both of those resources seek to encourage learners to consider the importance and effectiveness of various interpretations, methodologies, and methods of inquiry in religious education. Both presuppose that RE teachers in schools without a religious affiliation have neither the right nor responsibility to promote any singular theory or definition of religion or worldviews, or any singular mode of interpretation. Instead, their responsibility is to introduce pupils to a plurality of perspectives and to facilitate discussion and evaluation thereof. In practice, the researcher's approach involves presenting pupils with a series of cartoon characters, each personifying a research methodology and associated methods. Individually, the characters are called Debate-it-all Derek, Ask-it-all-Ava, Have-a-go-Hugo, and See-the-story Suzie. But collectively, they're known as the researchers. We could have produced many, many more researchers exemplifying different methodologies and methods. And if you want to debate whether we should do that, I will say, go on and do it. You've got my blessing. Each character holds different assumptions about the nature of religions and worldviews, has a preferred way of approaching the study of religions and worldviews, and employs particular methods of inquiry. So this is for primary school kids. So for each character, we try to create pictures, short descriptions. This is an inquiry cycle. We're trying to teach children, young children, in a really simple way about epistemological and methodological methods by personifying them in these cartoon characters. So learn how to undertake an inquiry like Debate-it-all Derek, and then learn how to undertake an inquiry like Ask-it-all-Ava, or like Have-a-go-Hugo. This is the most controversial one. We could talk about that for hours. Because you're having a go, you're practicing, you're like a participant or a non-participant observer, but generally a participant observer, and that causes conflict if we, in the Norwegian context, I know. But you're getting in there, you're immersing yourself in practice or activity. It's good that it's the controversial one. And See-the-story Suzie, which I was shoehorned in there because I was doing work in narrative theory, theology, and was trying to reconcile all my different projects together. So I personified another research project in here so I could say, yeah, it's all coherent. So once familiar with by the way, this slide is all the resources that we created to help teachers and pupils get their heads around these different approaches. Lots of tasks, explanations, looking at the characters' values, their activities, and so on. Once familiar with the hermeneutical and methodological particularity of each character, pupils can undertake learning processes associated with each of them in pursuit of different understandings of religions and worldviews. They can then discuss the phenomenon under study, the researcher character through whose eyes it has been viewed, their own skills, dispositions, and worldviews as researchers, and thereby learn about and implement multiple methodologies and methods, evaluating their significance, appropriateness, and effectiveness as they co-construct knowledge in collaboration with the teacher and their peers. So just as the Principles and Big Ideas of Science Education project focused on aligning pupil experience with current scientific knowledge and practice, getting the pupils working in a way similar to that of scientists, so it's possible to conceive of progression pathways from RE in the school classroom to the study of religions and worldviews in universities and beyond. So this alignment between RE and what goes on in higher education is really important to me. And there's overlaps between my presentation and Martin's earlier and sort of seeing that link. So following the work of Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger, the researcher's approach invites pupils to become nascent members of the communities of academic inquiry concerned with the study of religions and worldviews. Has to be plural, communities of academic inquiry, in recognition there are many communities out there, all researching in different ways, deploying different interpretations, methodologies, and methods. By providing pupils with intellectual and practical nous, know that and know how, they're bound not only by a willingness and ability to learn about religions and worldviews and learn how to learn about religions and worldviews, but they're also bound by a repertoire of communal resources, theories, concepts, methodologies, methods, and skills of which they should become increasingly self-aware. Thereby, they enter into the kind of informed, critical, and sensitive dialogues which are at the heart of such academic study, including epistemologically, methodologically, and hermeneutically orientated debates, albeit at a level which is hopefully age appropriate. I'll now move on to the Who is Jesus textbook as another example. For a secondary audience, this approach has been adapted in the textbook entitled Who is Jesus? This is a multi-perspectival examination of the figure of Jesus, encountered through a variety of cultural, religious, disciplinary, and methodological lenses. The textbook aims to engender in pupils an appreciation of the variety of ways in which any given topic can be approached. In this case, questions about the significance of Jesus are tackled by a variety of fictional and non-fictional scholars. In the researchers' approach for primary schools, they were all fictional cartoon characters. Here, we had a mixture of fictional and non-fictional, each unpacking aspects of their methodological methodologies and approaches, and reflecting on Jesus within and without biblical representation. So we had artistic, visually impaired, Muslim, feminist, and cross-cultural perspectives being explored, and pupils being encouraged to consider their own standpoint alongside those reflections. The aim, of course, or at least of course for me, is not to inculcate any particular view of Jesus, or to suggest that there is a single incontrovertible correct answer to the book's title question. For ultimately, who is to say whether there is a Jesus to be discovered, particularly in the context of schools without a particular religious affiliation in England? So it's very context dependent. Are some perspectives closer to reality, truth than others? Or are we just left with Jesus is, with none attaining greater credibility or validity than others? The questions, in this case, as well as the inquiries that flow from them, are of greater significance than the answers, at least in terms of the aim of initiating pupils into the discourses ongoing within the relevant communities of academic inquiry. As with the researcher's approach, through inquiry-based approaches, and by taking on different persona, here are the fictional scholars that we created. Those images were sort of stock images we found on the web. I really hope that none of them have been used to sell arms or drugs or anything. That would be really embarrassing, but so they're just things we found on the web. Through taking on these persona, again, learners are encouraged and enabled to become active, critical, and reflective investigators, learning to implement and evaluate a range of interpretive lenses and methodological tools in relation to real-world questions, to make sense of, make meaning from their findings, and then to identify further issues to be explored. It's an exact replication of the sorts of inquiries that we might undertake, or scholars of religion or theology might undertake within universities. Conclusions. I really like this slide because I put together like all of my books and stuff. Looks quite nice, apart from that one, which I hate, the vomit covered one. Debates continue to rumble on in English RE about what content should be taught and in what sequence. However, just as significant as substantive subject content knowledge is the need for RE pupils to be introduced to a wide range of perspectives, interpretations, methodologies, and methods, and for them to see, via that multiplicity, a way through to core ontological and epistemological issues associated with religions and worldviews and the study thereof. In schools without a religious affiliation, initiation into the communities of academic inquiry devoted to the study of religions and worldviews should avoid inappropriate inculcation into any particular religion or worldview, or even subconsciously suggest to pupils that religions or worldviews, whether in their particularity or as a whole, offer inherently good ways of interpreting our lives, reality, and the world around us. Part of that is the avoidance of promoting any singular mode of interpretation, because they all rest on their own assumptions about the nature of religions and worldviews, and those assumptions may infringe the rights of pupils to hold other assumptions. No single religion, worldview, and I would go further, discipline, interpretation, theory, methodology, or method should predominate. A diversity and multiplicity of approaches need to be used self-consciously by all participants. In the spirit of critical reflexivity, individuals need to recognize the particularity of their own worldviews and the context in which they developed in order to live and learn with and from difference. It's for these reasons that over the last decade at the University of Exeter, we've sought to develop a range of pedagogical approaches, some of which I've shared with you today, that promote critical engagement by learners with questions of representation, reflection, and research in the study of religions and worldviews, with the aim of equipping them with substantive, disciplinary and personal knowledge, as well as relevant scholarly skills and tools. And that's to enable them to understand the diversity of religions and worldviews present in the world. And by working on these various projects, despite my background as a historian of religious education, I hope to have contributed to ongoing discourses about progression, coherence, and breadth and balance within RE, and ultimately have gone some way to ensuring that RE does realise its full potential, as was desired by the schools inspector at Ofsted almost a decade ago. As part of this endeavour, and emerging from collaborations with teachers and researchers, I've developed this framework. There's bound to be flaws and gaps and holes that you can pick, but I hope it's simple enough that those teachers and curriculum developers and syllabus compilers and textbook writers can use it to guide their teaching, learning and assessment choices. So you have three elements that I think should be borne in mind when you're designing a curriculum or thinking about the pedagogy. At the top are those questions about representation, the focus of study, what is to be known, the know what, and in there recognising complexity, diversity, contextuality, contested nature of what we study and so on. Here, it's all about the research, the methods of study, the ways of knowing, the know-how. These are about the tools and the methods that we use to establish knowledge, how the subject matter being learnt about and why, what are the implications do these sort of choices have. And then bottom left, where I put Caroline the other day, but she didn't know it, is reflects, the subject doing the studying, the knower, the know-how, and getting them engaged in reflection and reflexivity, albeit I use the phrase personal worldview, but she might use existential configuration. So that's the model. I think when I talk to teachers or curriculum developers, bearing in mind the context of religious education in England, I kind of say it's okay to focus primarily on the top bit, in terms of what they're used to, the transmission of a certain body of knowledge, but this research bit is just as important, albeit perhaps there'll be less attention paid to that, and then smaller attention still paid to the question of reflexivity, which I liken to the kind of reflexivity that any good academic or scholar needs to show when they engage in study, to understand where they're coming from and how their positionality affects their research. And then right in the middle, I suppose, relates to that big idea about the real world and transferability and relevance, is the induction into communities of inquiry dedicated to the study of religions and worldviews. All of the pedagogical, I should say, as an example of how it's been implemented, the framework has been adopted by the recently published Challenging Knowledge in RE series of textbooks for primary and secondary schools, edited by Stephen Pett on behalf of RE Today Services, and that is being distributed to thousands of teachers of RE across the UK. It uses a version of that diagram right at the beginning to explain how their approach draws from my work. And within those, you will not just have knowledge about religions or worldviews, but you also get short descriptions of academics engaged in that study in universities across the UK, and the kinds of information, knowledge, the research that they've done, how they've done it, why they did it like that, what they found out. So again, students are being sort of inducted into those communities of academic inquiry, and that's by that particular textbook series. So to sum up, I should be quick, 1 minute left. All of the pedagogical and curricular approaches that I've developed assume the aims and purposes of RE, at least in schools without a religious affiliation, should be articulated first and foremost in academic and scholarly terms, explicitly aligned to and defined by pertinent disciplines in higher education, and the knowledge, skills and attributes that members of those communities of academic inquiry utilise to study religions and worldviews. This enables the subject's learning outcomes to be more precisely defined than they have generally been historically. This is important for me because broader and larger ambitions associated with other forms of development on the part of pupils, spiritual, moral, social, cultural, or the fulfillment of societal ends, e.g. the promotion of good citizenship, community cohesion, etc., have been highly and widely contested historically and are often unable to garner widespread and or long-term support. So to be non-prescriptive and open-ended about subject aims that extend beyond specific academic and scholarly goals is not to suggest that the knowledge, skills and attributes promoted by RE are not significant, relevant or transferable to the real world. Actually, I believe the study of religions and worldviews creates empowering circumstances of possibility in terms of how pupils might subsequently apply what they've learned or respond to what they've encountered. However, I don't believe we need to define and delimit these broader outcomes in detail in advance, in isolation from the academic and scholarly goals that I think should be the immediate focus of attention. History suggests that in doing so, we're more likely to provoke the kinds of public, political and professional debate that stymie progress and prevent the subject's development, ensuring that we are forever compelled to keep going round and round that same roundabout that I started with at the beginning. So I end with further reading. I only ever reference myself. So you've got a great long list of the kind of resources that I've drawn upon. Happy to circulate the slides, and all of the links work. So any of the resources that I've talked about, you can just click on and go to. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob, for this rich lecture, and thank you to the organizers for letting me respond to this exciting body of work. But how should I go about responding? I have never responded to a keynote lecture before, let alone held a keynote lecture. You should tear him down with difficult questions, my wife said when I asked her what a respondent to a keynote is supposed to do. I always ask my wife for help in academic matters. She's an academic herself and much more successful than I am, seemingly landing one grant after the other. So I figured she would know what I should do. Tear him down? I asked. Isn't that a bit dramatic? And why would I do that when I find his work really good and inspiring? For God's sake, I published a podcast interview with the man, and I actually have a printout of his researcher characters hanging on the wall of my office. You have a picture of him hanging on your wall? My wife exclaimed, looking for tea in the cupboard, mumbling something sarcastic about patriarchal structures. No, it's of our researcher characters, representing different ways of approaching religions, I explained. Then you should begin by tearing them down, she replied. Besides something about wearing a power outfit, the final advice my wife had was that I should talk about my own publications. You should definitely use the opportunity to promote some of your own work. You're a younger scholar, so you don't need to boost a senior academic giving a keynote lecture. But what if my work doesn't really speak to his work? I asked. You can connect anything to anything in academia. Haven't you seen how conferences always have titles that everyone is supposed to address? But then they all just talk about whatever they want to talk about anyways. You know, maybe the conference title has something like past and present or pathways and crossroads in it. And then you just make a random connection to your own research. When I asked a colleague of mine what a typical keynote response looks like, I got a very different advice. He said that it's more typical to celebrate the keynote presenter by talking about why the scholar and her work is so great, giving them an opportunity to further explore its merits. When I asked a friend of mine, who is also an academic, for advice on how to write my response, he said, I can't really remember any responses to a keynote, so I wouldn't worry much about it. Think of yourself Think of yourself as the support act in a concert that no one remembers or cares about. Only in reverse, you enter the stage after the main event. No one has come to listen to you. In fact, you give the audience a chance to go to the toilet before the keynote speaker engages in the Q&A. So, based on all these words of wisdom, I've decided to try and do three things in my response. One, celebrate Rob Freathy's work and give him opportunities to further expand on his ideas. Two, try and ask some critical questions. And three, as stealthily as possible, plug some of my own work and claim that it is somehow relevant to the keynote presentation. Finally, I got the advice to start on a light note with something funny. If you can make the audience laugh at the top of your presentation, they will follow you wherever you go. I found on a webpage giving advice on how to be a world-class presenter. So I decided I would try and say something funny, maybe about the keynote speaker, about Rob Freathy, but what? I decided to email Rob and ask him what he eats for breakfast. That could be funny, I thought. His response came quickly. And I quote, "For breakfast, I have a bowl of cereal with milk, cornflakes, bran flakes, porridge, etc. I wish I could say something more interesting." So I Googled bowl of cereal with milk UK and found this. But what's funny about that? How could I make this funny? After some thinking, I came up with three alternatives. Alternative one, I call it the "tell me what you eat and I will tell you who you are" approach. The problem with this alternative is that a bowl of cereal is such a normal and unremarkable breakfast. I often have a bowl of cereal for breakfast. So what does it say about Rob? That he's a normal person and unremarkable? That seems neither particularly nice or funny. Alternative two, Google search. I Google searched the question, what do you call someone who eats cereal for breakfast? Serial offender, the internet replied. Not funny, I thought. Besides, his presentation is not about the Catholic Church anyways. Alternative three, the food for thought approach. It seems like an obvious way to go, given that it's a phrase one could easily hear in a conference like this. But a bowl of cereal is not food for thought, it's just food. So I couldn't find which alternative to go for. I was first introduced to the RE Search's approach back in 2017 by a colleague. I didn't take much notice of it, for at the time everything in RE was new to me. It would take another 2 years until the 4 characters were hung up on my wall in the office as I prepared to employ them as fellow students across a whole term with a fresh batch of RE teacher students. I also brought the 4 characters and hung them up in the classroom and made it a habit to ask my students how they thought the different characters would think or approach the various religions and topics we were exploring. My favorite character has always been See-the-story Suzie, although my own research profile in the study of religion is much more akin to Ask-it-all-Ava. I'm not the only one in Norway that has embraced the RE Searcher's characters and approach. In fact, I know that Rob Freathy and his characters have been involved in several research proposals and projects in Norway, so much so that I was considering taking this opportunity to declare that Rob Freathy is big in Norway, inspired by the phrase big in Japan. But to be big in Norway implies that your work is not influential in other countries, and that's not true. His work is influential in England and Wales. The most recent Ofsted Research Review includes references to Rob Freathy's work and speaks of ways of knowing as one of 3 knowledge forms, mirroring Freathy's own 3-part model, or models, we could say. Finally, I know that Rob Freathy has been involved in various projects in Finland. Nevertheless, as Rob Freathy himself acknowledged in an email exchange about breakfast preferences, and I quote, "Internationally, Norwegian colleagues have been by far the most receptive to my approaches. This begs the question, why? One clue is certainly the introduction of the new curriculum in RE in 2020 in Norway, which introduces the notion of core elements, not unlike the notion of big ideas. There are 5 core elements in the new curriculum, and the second one is titled Exploring Religions and Worldview with Different Methods. And I'll let you read, well, it's partly covered, but I'll let you read it anyways. Is this core element inspired by Rob Freathy? I've decided to use this conference to try and figure that out. Geir Skeie is here, who has led the work of developing. And in any case, to me, this core element of Norwegian RE comes close to Freathy and Helen's big ideas of the study of religion and worldviews. And of course, it has made Freathy's work relevant, even more relevant, and he's been part of a workshop recently tackling this core element in Norway, and I think he's also part of a special issue coming up later in June, trying to figure out how will we do this in Norway. There's also another project in where your name appears, you might not be aware. This is a report from a fund dissemination project that I and Inge led a couple of years back, and it's titled 10 Unsolved Problems. We were a group of people that tried to come up with what are the 10 biggest unsolved problems for Norwegian RE in the coming 10 years. These kinds of lists are was inspired by similar lists in mathematics. And the second biggest unsolved problem, according to what we worked out in this project, is methods for exploration. What methods should we use to explore religions and worldviews? Why should we use these methods? And how should we do it in the classroom? The accompanying text refers to the RE searcher's approach. And I brought a copy of here, if anyone is interested. It's in Norwegian, unfortunately. So you see now how I'm plugging my own work? My wife would be very proud. Turning to the RE searcher approach, there are 3 features that I would like to highlight. First is the idea to promote a methodologically oriented RE via personification of research methodology in characters, whether cartoon or real researchers. This approach also comes with an already formulated purpose for RE, which Rob talked about at the end. As he put it in his lecture, it's possible to conceive of progression pathways from RE in the school classroom to the study of religions and worldviews in universities and beyond. And it comes with a pedagogical approach. It's critical, dialogical, and inquiry-based. It seems to me that many of us in this room would disagree on the purpose of RE, and of course RE looks different in different parts of the world. It also seems to me that we would support different kinds of pedagogical approaches, but I hope that Freathy's work convince us and will convince us of the merits of developing a more methodology-oriented RE. And with methodology, I mean research methodologies in this context. As some of my Norwegian colleagues know, I have begun to explore, inspired by Freathy's work and other work, I have begun to explore the first of these 3 features in my own thinking. The idea that we should promote a methodology-oriented RE, or at least a more methodology-informed RE. In an attempt to isolate the notion of including research methods and methodology in RE, I have proposed the phrase learning how, as in learning how we get knowledge about religion. I hope that this term can inspire a more methodology-informed RE in different contexts along the lines Rob Freathy suggests. In short, learning how points to knowledge about academic methods and the ability to use such methods adapted to the classroom setting. Thus, pupils should be able to create knowledge about religion, but also evaluate knowledge about religion, say in a textbook or media representation. Learning how, or lære hvordan, I have argued in 2 recent articles in Norwegian, should be viewed as a separate aim of RE or a potential aim. The RE searcher's approach is one way of realizing the aim of learning how, and it does so with a particular understanding of the purpose of RE and a particular pedagogy. But the notion of learning how, as in learning how we get knowledge about religion, can also be an aim tied to other kinds of purposes we might want to give RE. And it can be included in RE with different kinds of pedagogical approaches. Before this conference, I published a short dissemination piece on the notion of learning how in English after strict instructions from my wife. It's available online. Now, the phrase learning how is of course taken from the twin terms learning about and learning from religion. And here, I think I'm bringing us into the roundabout that you're talking about. The terms are heavily criticized, learning about, learning from. And many in this room, I'm sure, would argue that we should abandon them. However, they continue to surface in research, in debates globally, even 5 decades after they were first formulated. The terms learning about and learning from religion have been used to analyze and discuss different forms of RE, the purpose and aims of RE, teaching and learning in the classroom, and more. And while there is a variety of understandings of these terms, and the devil resides in the details we should know, I agree with Geir Skeie, who in a publication from 2012 suggests that learning about and learning from religion at the fundamental level raise the question of how we understand knowledge and formation or Bildung in RE. Learning how introduces a third element, namely the ability to evaluate and create knowledge. Hence the term broadens the landscape by inviting us to look at knowledge creation and Bildung. There are many signs of a growing interest in including learning how in RE. I have mentioned all of the ones listed here on top, except the 2 last points. There's a term disciplinary knowledge, which I see increasingly circulating in the UK. I see it in blogs from practitioners. Disciplinary knowledge refers to the knowledge and skills of the disciplines underpinning RE, study of religion, theology, methods included. And there is a Swiss debate, which I recently heard about. There's a special issue in the Zeitschrift für Religionskunde from 2020 that speaks of Denk-, Arbeits- und Handlungsweisen in Religionskunde, ways of thinking, working, enacting in RE. Petra Bleisch has explained to me that a key part of the Swiss debates relates to, and this is her words, how we can integrate adapted research methodology in primary education in RE in Switzerland. And it's inspired by recent developments in Didaktik des Sachunterrichts in Germany. I believe Martin Rothnagel presented on that yesterday, but I couldn't listen to it, unfortunately. But it makes me wonder, are similar discussions taking place in Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, Denmark? In any case, it sounds to me like Rob Freathy should travel to Switzerland. Now we've ended up with a couple of 3-part models. We have my humble proposal, which hooks the idea of a methodology-informed RE onto the famous, or should we say infamous terms, learning about and learning from. Rob's model, however, left us with a much more impressive, or Rob left us with a much more impressive and complex model: represent, reflect, research. In the keynote, Rob also phrased the model by speaking of 3 encounters, actually 4 in the big ideas, but we can take out 3 of them. 3 types of encounters: encountering religions and worldview, encountering oneself, and encountering methods and methodology. For those less familiar with Rob's work, this model from the RE Searcher material, which by the way is freely available online, might be more accessible and easy to get into. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to have a look at this. And I'm going to use this one alongside my own to raise 3 challenges at the end here. Challenge 1, the relationship between representation and research, between learning about religion, which we're familiar with, and learning how we get knowledge about religions. A simple question could be, don't you need to know the basic facts of religions before you can learn how to explore them, applying different interpretations and methods? A more open-ended question would be, how should we think about, and how do you think about, Rob, the relationship between learning about religion, which is very familiar to all of us and practitioners, and the more radical idea of learning how we research and explore religion with different methods and lenses? Challenge 2, what methods should we prioritize, and doesn't that depend on the purpose we give RE? In the introduction to your keynote, you refer to many possible purposes or aims to having RE in public schools. In the RE Searchers approach, and in your presentation, the main purpose of RE is to initiate pupils into the disciplinary knowledge and skills associated with theology and religious studies. But how many in this room would agree with that purpose? What if we say that the purpose of RE is intercultural competence or related to citizenship? Say we are inspired by Martha Shaw's formulation of religion and worldview literacy and claim that the purpose of RE should be to foster a kind of literacy that gives future citizens the ability to talk well about, engage well with, and in worldview diversity. If that was the purpose of RE, it would lead me to emphasize certain research methods, aiming at the contemporary world, maybe looking at disciplines like sociology and anthropology and less towards, say, history of religions, in the way that, for instance, Niels Korsvold presented 2 days ago. So what method should we prioritize, and doesn't that depend on the purpose we give RE? The third challenge has to do with the RE Searchers approach in practice and the need for empirical studies. One could imagine that the people who have listened to your presentation and your approach might have 2 worries. One, is this feasible in elementary school or school at all? Doesn't it involve a level of complexity and a certain amount of time that makes it difficult to realize this approach, even at the level of teacher education? Another worry, isn't this notion of a methodology-oriented RE quite radical? You can't just learn about Jesus. Maybe it's more important to learn how we can approach Jesus. Empirical studies would be helpful in responding to such worries, which, by the way, I don't harbor much. You mentioned yesterday that there are some small-scale studies that point to success. Are there also studies of failure, I wonder? And with that, I look forward to your response. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I thought that was a brilliant response, actually. I thought your wife sounds very wise. I've also got a much more successful wife that gets lots of research grant income, which she very rarely shares with me. She's in genetics. We're always trying to think of whether we could look at research methodologies, but there's not much genome-wide association studies associated with what we do. So I thought it was a really good response. I think your publications, apart from the Norwegian ones, which I would struggle with, sound really good. I must read those, and I quite like your framing here. There's obvious similarities. It's the bottom left, learning from, formation, build and side of things that I would struggle with. I would reject the formulation of learning from. That's not something I've picked up. What I'm proposing is slightly different from learning from. It's very, very tightly orientated to the children exercising reflexivity to enable them to understand their own positionality. It's not about formation or personal development, because I have no confidence that we would know in which direction the child should be developing, and therefore not know what interventions we should be putting in place to support their development. And we can't possibly support omnidirectional development of pupils. We would have to be steering them in some direction. So that would be antithetical. So it's very much tied towards those kind of initial kind of academic and scholarly goals that I set out. I think the approach and the formulation, that initiation into the communities of academic inquiry, one might say I've simply offloaded the problem to a different group of people. All questions about purpose, the ultimate rationale for studying religions and worldviews, I've simply said, we're going to initiate pupils into those communities over there. And so whatever they say by way of the reasons why we engage in this study, we kind of go along with them. So thereby we actually lose control over the ultimate purposes of the project. Of the subject, but nevertheless, it's probably an oversteer, it's probably a corrective to try to ensure that those engaged in thinking about religious education in England are talking to academic practitioners involved in the study of religions and worldviews, rather than talking to representatives of the faith communities who may not be involved in the academic study of the religions of which they're a part or not part of. So it's, where do you go to for authority? Where do you go to look for the kind of, I don't know, validated or publicly accepted knowledge in this area? Again, overlaps with Martin's presentation earlier. So I'm steering people towards a particular community, a particular type of knowledge, and more than happy to confess those elements, the elements with regard to the ultimate purpose, are the ones I feel most shaky on. So as a historian of the subject, and then working in the policy area, so history of RE policy, once we move into the realms about talking about purpose, I feel less confident. It's not my disciplinary background, and many people do that better. I think I come at it more like a policy formulator, like somebody who's writing official curriculum documentation. And it is as important to me the questions that I don't answer as it is the questions that I do. So what is the ultimate purpose of this subject? That's not for me. I think as like I'm the legislator. I'm the writer of the national curriculum. That is not for me to say. You know, that I'm not going to do it. So it's a question about who decides. And I would push that further down the system. I would push that closer to the ground, closer to schools and teachers, because all of these questions, and I take your point, there's some great presentations on human rights, we've had citizenship, these are really laudable. You know, we could have had sort of environmental sustainability issues. These are all really laudable, quite liberal aims for education. But I don't live in a liberal country anymore. I live in a country where I'm afraid about what the government will do next, in a country where my priority is about raising the levels of criticality of students to inoculate them against authoritarian states. So, yeah, so you've rightly, like you've touched on, you hit a nerve, you've gone for my Achilles heel, you're quite right to do so. That's the area where I suppose I kind of need to develop a kind of philosophy or theory, probably which is as much related to political philosophy as it is to theology or religious studies or educational didactics, which is about who should be making decisions about purpose and why would we be more circumspect about national policymakers in RE about trying to say, well, it's going to be all about this or it's going to be all about that. To actually say, well, we need to be really careful about that and we need to push that down. So I'm kind of dodging the question. I think I'm saying, great question. I'm not going to give you an answer. Someone else can. What else did you, learning how is nice. I like that formulation very much. It kind of relates to the ways of knowing. There's lots of overlapping work, and you're quite right to point to work that goes on within the UK in terms of disciplinary knowledge. My concern is that emanates from, it's a sort of teacher-led movement, and I think it emanates from people who characterize disciplines falling into all the same traps that people fell into when characterizing religions: fixed, homogeneous, sort of reified. It's like, that isn't the disciplines that I see within the university. I see lots of talk about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, you know, sociologists studying religion, theologians who are more like archaeologists. There's lots of blurring and blending of disciplinary boundaries. So I suppose I've always operated at the level below disciplines, which is more to do with the methodologies and methods that you might find in different disciplines. So you learn how to do that, accepting that it might occur in different types of discipline. Instead, we have a movement which talks about like theology, social studies or social sciences, philosophy. I think those are the way, and it's kind of like religious studies comes into social sciences. So the categorization kind of blows my mind. And I don't really like, I mean, once you get to social sciences, that's loads of different stuff. So I've gone down to the level of methodologies and methods. And as I said, we could have done so much more. You're spot on in terms of your purpose does affect your selection. So we could have a much longer discussion about if that's the purpose, then these are the methodologies and methods you would choose. I suppose whatever you choose has to be presented as merely an indicative selection of methodologies and methods, and it could have been otherwise. We could have used alternatives. We chose these are only some. The question is, how do you do that with children? We're going to study it this way, but let me tell you about all the ways we're not studying it. I mean, that's really hard. So is it feasible? Is there too much complexity? Again, I'd probably be really satisfied with classroom approaches that went a little bit of the way on this journey. I've nudged them in a direction of travel, even if they haven't like absorbed or embraced the fully fledged, worked out pedagogy that I've promoted. And indeed, in terms of the failure stories, not the success stories, it tends to be people have read the materials and cherry-picked the bits they like, and then absorbed the bits they like into their existing practice, which is nothing like what I endorse. And then they kind of say, well, I'm doing it. Oh, no, you're not. You're doing a little bit of it, a component of it, an element of it, but you've put it into a context which kind of negates that. And there's loads of examples of failure. I could spend hours talking about failure. The only person who I actually trust to do it, fully fledged, comprehensive, this is the ideal, the paradigmatic, is my brother. Because he's gone on the whole journey with me, and we developed it together. So it's in his bones, you know. He's probably one of the characters. He's probably all of them. I think I've addressed most of your questions. Anyone that I've not addressed is probably the really hard one. I really don't know how to talk to them.
Thank you.